So for making a quilt back, you are going to have to calculate a little bit of yardage, and it's not that difficult. You basically want a backing that is 4 to 8 inches taller and wider than your quilt top. And in order to figure out the yardage, you need to measure the height of your quilt top, add that 4 to 8 inches, depending on if you're sending to a long arm. They usually want the 8 inches bigger. If you're doing it at home, 4 to 6 inches bigger is completely fine. Then you will take that dimension with the additional inches and you will buy that amount in yards times 2. So say it's 80 inches, that gets us just over 2 yards. 2 yards is 72 inches. So we need to double that to 160 inches, and then we're going to divide that by yards. There's a whole formula. It's very simple on the blog because we need to cut those 2 pieces of fabric the same height and sew them together because most fabric is only 40 to 44 inches wide. So that's typically not going to cover the width of a quilt unless it's just a baby quilt. And so you will have to sew 2 pieces together. So backing, we are going to do first, and I will show you a couple different methods. One is just seaming it, not worrying about the pattern, and that works for overall prints. And the other is pattern matching, both done very, very similar, just a little bit more work for pattern matching. And then we'll go to the second video and I'll show you how to baste your quilt. This is all a lot to think about, but that's why we're doing it in smaller chunks, and you can take as long as you need to do each step of this process, and hopefully these videos will help. So I grabbed a quilt. This is my clogged pattern, and I wanted to open it up to show you the backing. So backings are what are on the back of the quilt. Of course, it faces right side out so we can see the beautiful design. Backings typically have to be pieced. I'm trying to find the seam in this one. Here we go. Because quilting cotton is 40 to 44 inches wide, and our quilts are much wider than that typically. The new Star quilt is 66 inches square for the version we're making, and there's definitely other sizes you can do. So you're going to have to seam. I don't know if you can see this. This is a good example of a great print to use on a backing for a beginner quilt because you don't need a pattern match. You could. Pattern matches mean you align the pattern up perfectly and seam along that match so that the back does look seamless. But this being a smaller overall print, it is not super visible. Other things you can do for the backing of your quilt is piece a backing with some patchwork, leftover fabrics from the front, add some words, do a little fun block on the back. Backings typically do need to be pieced. There are wide backs in quilting, so they're usually 100 to 120 inches wide. I think 108 is the normal width, and then you buy that by the yard, the same thing. It's just wider this way, but the yardage going this way is the same. For any quilt back, what you want to do is measure, just to be safe, measure from the top to the bottom and side to side to get the exact dimensions of your quilt. So the new Star quilt is 66 inches square that we're making. If you did not add the HST border, it will be 60 inches square. So what that means is we need a backing that is roughly 70 inches square. We want our backing to be, let's pull this back out here. This is a corner. So let's see here. For basting at home and quilting at home, a backing that extends out the sides between 2 and 4 inches is great. 2 inches is plenty. That is this much wider than the edge or the sides of your quilt. And the same for the top or the bottom. The reason that is because we want to have a little bit of extra as we're smoothing, as we're quilting. We're going to smooth and be as taut as possible so that we don't have any bubbles or folds in the fabric. And sometimes as we're smoothing, it can make our quilt top a little bit bigger. And sometimes the quilt top can get askew on the backing and the batting, and that gives us a little bit of give if we have 2 inches all the way around to play with in case our quilt top kind of skews a little bit to one side or isn't perfectly rectangle. That sometimes happens for beginner quilters. Seam allowance, not being perfect at straight long seams, things like that, can sometimes make your quilt top slightly unrectangle or unsquare. So, how to figure out how much fabric you need. The one thing I want to mention before we decide how much fabric we're going to cut is that if you're sending to a long armor, you need to check their website for how much bigger, wider, and longer they want your backing and batting to be. Most long armors want at least 4 to 8 inches per side, because it's much different when loading it on a long arm machine than when you're quilting on your quilt, your domestic machine. So if you're sending it to a long arm and piecing your backing, please make sure you check first before you cut your fabric and sew it together. Because of course, once we cut our fabric, we can't go back. There are a couple things you can do. If for some reason you cut it too short is usually the problem, because the width, you'll see why. There's not often problems with width being too small unless you're getting to much larger quilts. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the height dimension of our quilt, 66 inches, and we're going to cut it 2 inches bigger on the top and the bottom. So we're adding 4 inches. And I would even say 5. I like to err on the side of caution. So we need a piece of fabric that's 71 inches long. We actually need 2 of those, which would be just under 4 yards of fabric for the new Star quilt. This will change for every quilt. It's based on the size of your quilt. If you are reading the blog posts with the YouTube video, you can see calculations to figure out how to get the exact right size of your quilt backing for your quilt top. So I actually happen to have bolt fabric here, and I'm pretty sure I have enough, but you will probably have a long piece from your quilt shop wherever you got it, online or in person. And we're going to cut this the exact same as when you cut your fabric off the pieces you bought for the front. We have our folded edge here, and we kept it folded because cutting long pieces of fabric is very tough. What we want to do, knowing we need 71 inches of length, is we want to make sure this first cut is really straight, and we do that because quilt shops are not always perfect in their cutting. They usually give you a 1/2 inch to 1 inch longer than the amount you asked for. If you asked for 1/2 yard, it's 18 inches, and most of the time they'll give you a little bit bigger than that. And the reason that is because they don't want to short you, so it's easier just to give a little bit more. We want to do the same thing we did with our fabric to cut out all of our pieces, is make that registration line all the way across by lining up our ruler along the folded edge, just doing a straight line across. And that way we can start measuring. There are 2 ways that you can measure this. If you have a measuring tape, you can use a measuring tape. Usually these are 60 inches long, so you will have to continue measuring after the end. I do also have longer ones that you can find some places. That's helpful, or you can use your cutting mat, and I typically recommend using the longest side of your cutting mat, which is what we're going to do today. And I will show you this as well, but not everybody has a flexible ruler like that. So let's just rotate the cutting mat here for us. So we have, this cutting mat is 36 inches from one line to the next line. And that's going to help us. I'm actually going to just end up cutting this at 72 inches because that will be a little bit easier measurement. You could cut it anywhere from 70 to 72. If you are getting exactly a 4-yard cut for your new Star quilt, you are probably going to have to cut off a tiny bit for cleaning up those edges, and it might not end up being a full 4 yards. So therefore, you would probably want to cut 71 inches. 4 yards is 2 cuts of 72 inches. What we're going to do to measure is we are going to align it directly with the line that is your 36 inch. It could be your 1 inch, but on mine, if your board is backwards, but on mine, it's the 36 inch. I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to smooth this fabric across. And notice I am measuring on the selvage side. You can really measure on either side. Just remember, if your selvages look like they're rippling a little bit, you're going to want to pull them so your fabric is smooth, because that ripple can skew the dimension a little bit. I'm going to put a pin exactly on top of the line on the other side of my cutting mat, which for me happens to be 36 inches. You potentially have a 24-inch mat, but the longest dimension you can measure on your cutting mat, mark the edge to a pin and then continue down. We're going to align our pin with our first mark till we get our second mark. It is good to keep your fabric pretty straight. It's not the most necessary, but it will help in the long run so that you don't get any buckles or ripples in your fabric. And then I'm going to smooth it down till I get to my 36 mark again. The other reason that I am doing this at 72 instead of 71, which is perfectly enough, is because I may put this on my long arm. I have 2 new Star tops I'm going to help show you quilting with. So now we have our pin in our 36-inch mark, and that's our second 36-inch mark. We're going to grab our cutting mat again, and we still actually do have our pin over here. You could leave that in or take it out. It's kind of nice to leave it in so you have that middle mark for the moment. I'm going to align my ruler on the folded edge. So often I do this on the folded edge because that's where I need to align my ruler. But because of the way my fabric rolled off the bolt this time, and aligned this way on the folded edge, and then coming across, we want to make sure it lines up right with that pin. And then you want to scooch that pin out of there as best you can, because you don't want to cut over it with your rotary blade. And cut that fabric. Now, before you cut that fabric, I do not think it's a bad idea to double check your measurement. There have been times when I have not double checked my measurement and I have been sad. If for some reason you don't get the exact height you need for your quilt top, I'll give you a trick after we've cut the second piece of how to make it taller with some piecing. So there is, it's folded over now, and it's 72 inches long. This is roughly 40 inches wide. We need to cut 1 more of these because we need to piece it along the selvage edges to make our piece. It'll end up being between 80 and 84 inches wide probably, which we can trim down or not to quilt with, but we need the height to be 4 to 5 inches taller than the height of our quilt, and we need the width to be at least 4 to 5 inches wider than the width of our quilt. And depending on your long arm or not, that might need to go up a little bit. So here's one piece. I'm going to keep this pretty handy because I actually, before I cut my second piece, want to measure it to my first piece for 2 reasons. Let's just set that aside. For the second piece, you have to decide if you're going to pattern match or not. And pattern match usually takes a little bit more fabric because you have on your fabric repeats. You see these two horses here? Each horse from the top of the point to the top of the point, that is one repeat going across. So that means that same section from point to point is going to be repeated however wide that is, every 9-ish inches. So if I was going to take a fabric and a line and just randomly cut 2 pieces without thinking about pattern, you can see that our pattern isn't going to match up. It's close, but it's not exact. We can see these 2 horses are the same in the repeat. And what we really need to do if we wanted a pattern match is do this and, align it much better than that. But it's a little bit different in size. So this piece needs to be this size. So that means because it's shorter, we would have to shift this down to the next horse and cut off this part. Pattern matching is awesome, and I probably am going to pattern match on this fabric, but it's not necessary. And that is why I showed you the clogged quilt, because this quilt is not pattern matched and you can't even see the seam. It took me a little bit of time to find it, and only up close, and I'm struggling to find it again. I think only up close would you be able to see the seam. I can't actually find it, so that's kind of funny. Is there a seam? Nobody knows. I saw it earlier, so did you guys, I think. Oh, here it is. It was on the other side. Right there is the seam, barely visible. But on the unicorns, it probably would be visible, because if I'm just going to align this like this, it's too off in my opinion. If you cut your first piece slightly bigger than you need, say you need it to be 4 inches bigger than your quilt top, but you cut it 6 inches bigger and you have a little discretion in your pattern, you could chop that off and probably be fine. I'm going to see how much fabric I have of that, and then this will determine if I'm going to pattern match or not. I'm going to kind of align it so I know roughly where I need to do that first dimension from. And let's see if I have enough fabric to do a pattern match. I'm not going to sweat it if I don't, because the backs, while can be very beautiful, and some people do some major piecing, they're just not noticeable as much. Like, you don't notice the back too often, especially when you're using it because it's laying on top of you. So I'm going to start that pin at my 36-inch mark, measure down to get my first line, and then move that up to get my next one. Aligning it on this 36-inch mark again, keeping my fabric pretty straight, and it looks like we have enough. So what I'm going to do for pattern matching is I am going to cut it slightly longer than I need. I do have it slightly higher up there. Let's bring over our fabric and go to the bottom of your print to see where that needs to line up. Oh, see, we're much farther down than I think oh, there we go. That's the horse I'm gonna be matching, those 2 horses. So I do need to go down a little bit further. You just want to make sure that you are not cutting your fabric piece too short for your pattern match. And if I scoot it down just like an inch further, that'll be fine. And then I'll trim this second piece to size a little bit later. If you are not pattern matching, please, please just cut your fabrics, both your long pieces, to be exactly 72 inches. Or 71 inches would be fine. And then cut both of them with a nice clean line at the 90-degree angle from the folded edge. Okay, we are going to turn our mat back around. This is where it helps to have a big table, but don't worry if you don't have a big table. You can let it fall off the edge of a table for this, or you can just kind of bunch it up on one side. For pattern matching, laying the fabric out straight is going to be a little bit better. But if you're just sewing two pieces together without pattern matching, having those bunches is not a big deal. For two pieces with no pattern matching, what I want you to do is fold the long side in half, 72 inches in half at 36 inches. And on one of the salvages, that's this side with the little frayed edges, I want you to put a pin on the salvage on the side you're going to sew. So that means this has two salvages. We're only going to sew one salvage to the next piece. And so I'm going to put my pin, which I have one right here. It's almost exactly in the middle. I'm going to pull away the second salvage, keeping that folded where it comes up in the middle, and I'm going to put my pin there. We're going to do the same thing on both fabrics, but on the second fabric, I want you to do it on the opposite salvage. So I'm going to do the same thing on the second fabric, but where this pin is on this salvage, I'm going to turn my second piece over and I'm going to put that pin on this salvage. So when we're pinning them, say we're pinning these two together, we can meet the ends and then we can meet the pins in the middle for our middle spot, and then we can meet this end. And then we're going to, if you want to, if you feel you need more pins, you're going to stretch between the two pins here and you're going to pin more pins along there, keeping the fabric taut and even to each other. And then you'll do the same on the second half. Pattern matching is not much different, but we do need to open it up so we only have one fabric thickness here. And we have our edge. And what we want to do is find the top edge of our fabric here that matches and is wasting the least fabric. It doesn't really matter when we sew these together, they're going to be between 80 and 84 inches wide. So if you wanted to take off a bunch of fabric, you could, but it looks like we can kind of start between the tails here, and we're going to have to come down here, and that's kind of where we're going to pattern match. Pattern matching is where you try and align the fabric exactly on top of the fabric underneath of it so your patterns line up perfectly. And a way you can do that is by first aligning. So I've got that lined up pretty perfectly. And then I can either pin it in place and I can press along the seam, and then it's tricky. This is a multi-step process. What I need to do is after I press along that seam, I need to open it up, and this tail part here that's sticking out, I need to pin my pins going in the direction that is easiest to pull them out. Remember, we sew with the fabric, all the fabric to the left of the presser foot. So the foot is coming in from this direction and the fabric is going in this direction, and we need to be able to pull our pins out. So after I press that seam, I flip it over and I pin in place so that I can take these pins out. And then I can flip it back, and on that crease that is pressed into the fabric, I am going to do the third pin. It is a little bit of a process, but I'll show you another way as well. And then you will know those are pinned perfectly, and you're going to sew exactly down on top of that crease, and you can take these out. So that's one a little bit harder method for pinning your fabrics together. Another is going over to your machine and ironing your fabric over about the same amount all the way down. So we want it to be very even all the way down if it's 2 inches, and then we're going to get this ironed crease in there, and then we can come back with that iron crease and use a glue stick. So you would take your glue stick and you would just rub a little bit of glue along your creased edge. You can use Elmer's glue that's washable. This is for EPP glue stick. Any glue that's washable will work great for this. So once you have the crease ironed in and you have that glue applied, you can just align your fabric right over top of where you are going to sew it together. Pardon my head a little bit. And press that glue in. I think it works to heat set it, and then it'll be glued together. Because I'm not a big glue person, I would tend to also pin it by opening it up, and the glue will hold it in place, and pinning either right along or right next to that crease that you ironed in. And that is a much simpler way, but you do have to have glue. I do know that Pen and Paper Patterns has an awesome glue applicator tip for Elmer's glue that could work for this as well. So I'm going to get my whole fabric aligned here, and then I am going to have it pinned in place, and then we will go and sew it. The tips with sewing long pieces together, if you do not have a bunch of pins. So remember how we pinned the top and we pinned the middle and we pinned the bottom. And then I said it's up to you if you want to put a bunch of pins in between the middle and the top and in between the middle and the bottom. If you put a bunch of pins in, just sew, take those pins out as you go and continue on down. If you did not put pins in between the middle and the top, as you're sewing, you want to kind of keep those two layers taut together so that they are stretched and as even as possible. If for some reason you don't do that or don't have them pinned, if you were to just sew along, sometimes at the bottom, even though they're cut to the right size and the seam size, because of the tension on the machine, sometimes one can end up buckling a little bit and having excess, and that's what we don't want. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that it's always good to pattern match your shorter fabric when you're pattern matching. Remember how I cut the second one taller on the top and longer on the bottom? It's best to have your shortest one on top so that you can really make sure that you have the proper pieces in the proper spot. We wouldn't want to start doing this one and get to the bottom and realize that it was not going to have enough fabric. Okay, we do have our whole seam pinned and glued together here. You could, if you are sewing like this and you have some big extra fabric here, you could trim off this. I usually on my backings leave about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that would mean cutting it off roughly 1/2 inch from the crease. And you can eyeball it. You could come from this side if your pins are in the way. You can leave this and trim that off after you have it seamed if you're wanting to be extra careful. You're going to seam it exactly on top of that crease. And remember from other piecing that your thread does give a little bit of thickness. So if you're going to err on the side of caution, err towards the cut or salvage edge and not towards the rest. I'm going to show you on this side. Remember that side is our glued pattern match side. This is our other 2 edges, which will just be left loose. But I want to just demonstrate something real quick. If you are not pattern matching and you are just sewing top to bottom, you're going to pin it just like I suggested, a 1 pin up here, 1 pin in the middle, and 1 pin at the bottom. You have these salvage edges though, and sometimes you might be able to tell the salvage edge can tend to be slightly tighter than the weave of the fabric. So it can be beneficial to cut those off prior to sewing. You can either cut them off right along the edge of where the salvage meets the fabric, where this white meets the fabric color. Or if you do not want to cut them off, just pin and sew. Well, you can pin anywhere, but you want to sew about a 1/2 inch in from that salvage edge and then trim it after you sew your long seam line. So if I was going to do this one, I would probably cut my salvage off first. I would probably come along here, cut after I aligned them right on top of each other, frayed edges aligned, and then I could cut them both, and then I could pin them, and I have my edges matched up for my 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's what I would tend to do, and then you can pin top, middle, bottom, and a couple in between, and you'll be good. But sometimes these salvages can make them skew a little bit in the stretch of the fabric. So I would tend to cut them off personally. If you are uncomfortable doing that, just make sure your frayed edges are very well aligned and sew a 1/2 inch in from the deepest salvage. You can see on this side of the fabric, there is a white salvage, and on this side of the fabric, the color extends. And I'm not sure why that is, but often these printed salvages like this or this other color are deeper than this side. So you want to go with the deepest side after you align them up, cut off the tallest or deepest salvage. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So just continuing along your line, cutting the salvages off. When you get to the end of your ruler, just move your fabric down, realign those salvage edges, and then make sure everything is flat. And where your last cut was, align the edge of your ruler with that last cut. This isn't the edge of your quilt, so I'm not overly concerned if it is not perfectly straight. It's going to be okay as long as it's mostly straight. So that is what I would do for the whole length of your seam if you are not pattern matching. If you're pattern matching, you don't really need to worry about salvages yet. So let's go to the machine and sew your backing. Okay, we're at the machine, and I thought I would show you with a basting stitch so that I can take it out easily, sewing together. If you are just sewing from end to end, I put a pin at the top, and let's just call this my pin at the middle. And when you sew, you want to kind of tug these just a little bit to make sure that they are both evenly distributed along the way, and you're going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So let me put this down and I'll pull you in closer. I'm going to turn up my stitch length, which is this for me on my machine. That just means that my stitch, instead of being shorter is longer so that I can easily pull those stitches out when I want to pull them out, because I am going to be just demonstrating this here, but really I'm sewing the other side that I did for pattern matching. So for sewing the backing seam, you want 1/2 inch seam allowance. You do want a back stitch at the beginning and end, and then you are just going to sew, making sure that it stays on your 1/2 inch seam allowance line. And as you get to the pins in the middle or the pins along the side, you're just kind of tugging those, not enough to keep it from feeding through the machine, but just enough to make sure that your 2 pieces of fabric are staying evenly distributed between the pins. And then you're just going to sew all the way down and backstitch at the other end. If you have pins along here, you're going to take them out as you sew. But if you don't have any pins, you're just going to make sure when you get to the middle pin that you have a nice even distribution of fabric. So that's how you're going to sew together if you are not pattern matching. Okay, now we have the pattern matched seams on our machine, and remember that they're glued along here, and then I also have pins. You are going to just sew directly on the ironed crease. You are going to backstitch at the top, and as you are sewing in the crease and going down, just kind of make sure your fabrics are, hopefully the glue is stuck or the pins have kept it in place, but just kind of smooth out your fabric to make sure there's no folds or nothing is getting out of place, so to speak. And you may or may not have already cut off the selvage. I tend to do that after I sew, just in case if there's any spot along my seam that hasn't matched up well enough, I can unpick a little bit and reposition and re-sew. And I just feel like I like to have this extra fabric over here to make me feel comfortable with that. Now, some of these pins are getting close to the line, so I am going to take them out as I'm sewing. Otherwise, if they are far enough over, you could just leave them and not really worry about them at all. When you get to the end, you're going to do another back stitch, and you want to make sure your back stitches are fully on top of both pieces of fabric, because we are going to trim the bottom piece here. So here we have our 2 fabrics seamed together, and I am going to take out these pins that I left in there, and then I'm going to trim a 1/2 inch away from my seam allowance after I check the seam that it is all lined up and proper. And then we're going to trim on this one, the top or bottom, and then we will iron our seam open and flat, which is a little bit different. We have not ironed any seams opened yet in our course. Okay, we have our seam matched here, and it's not perfect, I would say, but it's close. Not too bad. It's good enough that I am not going to fix anything. So what we want to do now is we want to trim off different parts of this backing. I thought I would give you guys a little bit different vantage point. So any pins that might be in there, you definitely want to take out. And then align your ruler with the 1/2 inch mark along your seam directly, and then just trim off this whole side that is all the salvages, so that you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance down the whole quilt. I thought I would pop you right back up there so you can see that. I'm going to turn sideways, and this is just my personal preference. I like to start at the bottom and work my way up so I can kind of pull it back as I am going. You want to smooth out both layers very flat so you don't trim anything off that you shouldn't be trimming. And having as much fabric as possible available to trim is ideal. So my 1/2 inch line is right on top of my seam. If it's a little bit less or more in some spots, that's totally fine. So trim that away, shift your fabric down, again, keeping it as smooth as possible, and then overlapping your ruler on this first cut so that your 1/2 inch will stay lined up. Keep the 1/2 inch mark on the seam, it lined up to your cut, and then pivot your ruler so the 1/2 inch is lined up the rest of the way, and continue that cut up. You want some overlap here so that your line stays pretty straight. It is just a seam allowance, so it's not the worst thing if it's not perfectly straight. So we're just kind of trying to smooth out some of those wrinkles. I've got probably like a 4 to 5 inch overlap, and then I'm just cutting up. That strip over there is a great strip to save for binding, or a great strip to cut up into squares. Just making sure the quilt top is out of the way. Again, aligning it with the edge that I cut and aligning it with the 1/2 inch on the seam allowance, which should be accurate, and then up 1/2 inch on the seam allowance and continuing that cut straight. So we just saw a long cut of me trimming off for the seam allowance, which is not too hard, but you didn't have to be super accurate for the seam allowance. For the trimming of this top piece, I have the top piece flat on the cutting table, right? It extends above the short piece. We're trimming down to the same size of the short piece, and I want it to be as flat and smoothed out as possible. The short piece on top, I'm folding back in half at that bolt fold, like so it has a nice smooth, and I'm aligning my top 2 edges. And then I'm going to take my ruler and align it with those top 2 edges all the way across, and it's going to extend past a little bit, and that's fine because our fabric is going to be smooth and straight, and we're going to cut to the end of the ruler. Pull that away. Now the trick here is to pull all of these layers at the same time by kind of grabbing them all at the bottom in a couple places and very carefully smoothing it forward so we can extend our ruler and cut the rest of that fabric off. We want to keep our registration by allowing our ruler to line up perfectly with that cut already. So if we have to move it a couple times, I cut a little bit more, slide my ruler, keeping it against my blade, and then realigning it back here on my edge and continue that cut. You could pull away your rotary blade and just realign the ruler a 3rd time, and now you have a perfect cut across the whole top. We're going to do that same exact process on the bottom, but it is going to be backwards unless you can kind of rotate your fabric a little bit because it's kind of in reverse. Now we have the bottom folded in half. Everything is perfectly smooth. We have the larger piece that we're cutting down sticking out from the bottom of the top piece, and we're going to align our ruler along the edge of the top piece and cut it off. We are going to grab sections, keeping everything as smooth as possible and shimmying it up, so to speak, so we can realign our ruler along this cut edge, cut further, and then do one more last shimmy and cut. Don't worry if it looks like what you're cutting off is not perfectly straight. It could be a little bit thicker on one side and thinner on the other because that cut was probably not straight from the beginning. We have our backing seamed vertically, so now we want to cut down our width. So you don't have to cut down your width. You could keep it the full width of 2 pieces of fabric. It's just a little bit more to manage, and you might not have a space large enough. This is going to be roughly 80 to 88 inches wide, and that's a lot of fabric to manage by, I think we cut it at 72. Ideally, we're going to cut this down to roughly 4 to 5 inches wider, so 71 to 72 inches wide. Remember, our quilt top is 66 inches square, and we did 72 inches high. So now we want to measure, let's just do the same dimension wide, so we have a nice square. Sorry, my cutting ruler is under there. So what we're going to do, it's okay if you still have salvages on to include those salvages in your width, because we shouldn't be getting anywhere close to them. So along one edge, we're just going to measure, and remember, we can do this either by measuring along your cutting mat and using a pin to mark when we're moving farther, or we can measure it using a measuring tape. And if using a measuring tape, we're going to do the same thing. We want to use a pin to mark where our measurement, I stopped at 36 inches, and I'm going to slide my fabric over, smooth out the next portion. This is where my seam is, and I'm going to take my measurement from where I pinned it and measure another 36 inches. So I am getting the same size either way. So this fabric is probably a little bit smaller in width because I'm cutting off not that much, but I also cut off some significant width when I did my pattern matching. If you did not pattern match, I would guess you'd be cutting off at least 12 to 15 inches. So right now we have like 9.5 inches we're going to cut off. That's not much at all. So there's a couple ways you can cut this, and it's kind of like practicing and seeing what is easiest. Let's smooth it out really nice and straight. When you smooth it out, just make sure none of that extra fabric is like lipping under. What you can do is align your ruler perfectly straight along one of the cut edges right by your needle. And then you want it that perfectly straight, so it's going up perfectly straight, and you can cut. That's one way you can do it. Another way you can do it is aligning your edge along your mat and making sure it's lined up perfectly along a cutting line. So that's right along the edge, and then I know that this is 9.25, roughly wherever the pin is. So then you can measure out, and you can use this ruler and a second ruler. This ensures the exact amount of width being cut off all the way down. Because it's less than 12 inches, if I align this ruler on the pin and I align this ruler on the edge and making sure, so I'm doing 6.5 and then 3, and then I'm going to make sure that 3 is lined up perfectly along the edge, and I'm going to cut along here, and then I'm going to move both of these down. So I'm basically using 2 rulers to get a little bit larger size. The third way to do it is to fold it in half. Okay, we folded our fabric in half so that our 2 raw edges are aligned. And I actually am going to have those, I want to just measure those to make sure of how wide from the corner we are. And we are about 8 5/8. I'm going to go 8.5. So keep that measurement in mind. You want to measure, you can take out your pen or leave it. But you want to align these cut edges and then align your cut side edges, or you might still have a salvage here. Align your salvages. Smooth it all flat, and make sure as you flatten it out and as you come to your folded edge that your folded edge is smooth and flat and not wrinkled or askew, I guess. Because we are a little bit wider than 8.5, we're at 2.5 that we want to cut out. I'm going to use that second ruler trick again, knowing I have 6.5, so I need to add 2 more inches. So I'm going to line 2 inches along there. Then I can butt my ruler up, and I'm going to make sure that it is aligned on the folded edge as well. And then I'm going to make my first cut. You don't have to go all the way down your ruler. You can. I'm at a little bit of an odd angle, being on the opposite side of how I typically cut. And then slide our ruler up. I need to cut the next part. So I'm going to grab both of these and evenly pull it down so I can reach the rest. And then I'm going to align my ruler along this cut edge. And I want as much of my ruler on this cut part as I can get to finish my cut. So I could pull it down a little bit more. That ensures that my line continues and is as straight as possible. And I'm just going to hold my ruler and cut all the way down. That's a good way to cut really long cuts if you're ever cutting for a border that's a really long cut or anything like that. Now we have made our quilt backing. Any of these extra pins you can take out. We've cut it down to size. So we're about 72 inches square to fit our 66-inch square quilt top. So I'm going to go iron it. For ironing your seam on the backing of your fabric, remember we potentially may have glued that seam together to pattern match. If you did that, you're going to have to separate the fabric and then use another fabric over top of it to iron it open and flat, because you don't want to get any glue residue on your iron plate. You could also iron to the side, but you will have a little bit thicker, noticeable bump in your backing if you iron to the side. Ideally, you're going to iron open, so just use like a scrap. This is just something I cut off, and just open that seam up and just roll your scrap over it, and then you can iron right on top and not get any of that glue residue onto your iron plate. That glue residue will wash out in the wash, so you don't really have to worry about it being inside your quilt or anything. It's just more for the ironing. And if you didn't have any glue residue, that's awesome. Just iron it as normal, ironing your seam open. So we have the flattest, smoothest seam that we can when we are basting. And again, like I said, in the event that you are not pattern matching, I also mentioned this, iron the rest of your backing to smooth out any additional folds or creases that happened from the bolt or when you put it in your stash or bringing it back from the fabric store. So we have a nice flat seam. I do have a little bit of glue residue, not a big deal. These are the creases I'm talking about ironing. This is a crease that is from the bolt. It's best to iron those out. You might have one on one side, maybe a second one on your other side, depending on how much you trimmed it. So just ironing those as flat as possible, and any other wrinkles that may have happened in the meantime.